Thank you all for coming and putting up with the change of venue at the last minute. It's really wonderful to see so many people here to hear about Woolf. It's often been assumed that music was the art in which Virginia Woolf, and indeed the so-called Bloomsbury group more widely, was least interested. Virginia Woolf described herself as not regularly musical, and her biographer and nephew Quentin Bell observed that music provided merely a background to her musings. I do not think she could follow a score with any deep comprehension. The Bloomsbury Group's extensive involvement in the art world, as producers of paintings, of arts and crafts, as curators bringing unfamiliar new works such as post-impressionism to British audiences, as critics publishing reviews and art criticism, and as creators and leaders of workshops, including most famously the Amiga workshop, has tended to overshadow these individuals' interest in and contributions to music. But a sample of their activities gives a sense of their diversity. In 1918, Roger Fry decorated an early keyboard instrument made by Arnold Dolmetsch. In 1931, the Russian ballet dancer Lydia Lopukova proposed to set a scene from Orlando to music and to dance to it behind a microphone. In 1932, Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant decorated a music room for the Lefebvre Gallery in Bruton Street, London. And in 1933, Vanessa Bell designed sets and costumes for Constance Lambert's ballet Pomona. In addition to these public activities and commissions, music was a daily part of life for many of the Bloomsbury Group. Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant regularly painted to the accompaniment of the gramophone in their studio at Charleston. Records were swapped and played at parties and at dinners. T.S. Eliot, for example, visited Leonard and Virginia Woolf to listen to jazz, while a gramophone was taken to the top of Sissinghurst Tower to be played by Vita Sackville-West during a party. And music was discussed at length. Woolf's circle included Roger Fry's partner Helen Anrep, who had trained as an opera singer, the composer and critic Lord Berners, the historian and librettist R.C. Trevelyan, Maynard Keynes, the economist who was staging ballets professionally with Lydia Lopukova, and the pianist and music critic Edward Sackville-West. Ethel Smythe, undoubtedly the best-known female composer in Britain in this period, the author and militant suffragist who had gained her musical training in Brahms' circle in Leipzig, became one of Virginia Woolf's most intimate friends in the 1930s. And through Ethel Smythe, Woolf met eminent professional composers and performers, including the exiled German Jewish conductor Bruno Walter and the French composer and teacher Nadia Boulanger. Woolf attended numerous performances as Smythe's guest. She accompanied Ethel Smythe to at least one rehearsal of her work and discussed music and literature with her repeatedly. After their first meeting in 1930, Virginia Woolf wrote, "I like to hear her talk of music," confident that what she called the basis of an undying friendship had been made in 15 minutes. But Virginia Woolf's knowledge of and interest in music extended far beyond the vicarious pleasures of friendship and conversations with musicians. Though her own childhood music education was a casual one in singing and piano, typical for a girl of her class, she read music theory and criticism throughout her life, and the works that we know she read suggest she had a solid grasp of musical terms. In 1905, early in her professional career as a critic, she even reviewed the 5th volume of the Oxford History of Music, the Viennese Period, by W.H. Haddow. And in this review, she adopts and champions the perspective of the interested amateur, what we might call the common listener, as she often does in her writings on music, whether in her novels or her essays or in her private writing. In part, this was the result of her recognition of women's marginalisation within professional music in Britain, a fact brought home by the accomplishments of her brother Adrian and his friends who composed music together. In her 1920 essay, The Intellectual Status of Women, Woolf identifies music as exemplary of women's inequality in formal education, contradicting writing in response to the critic known as Affable Hawke, who had argued that There was nothing else but intellectual inferiority to prevent, down the ages, so far as I can see, women who always played, sang and studied music, producing as many musicians from among their number as men have done. Woolf's response? Was there nothing to prevent Ethel Smythe from going to Munich? Was there no opposition from her father? Did she find that the playing, singing and study of music which well-to-do families provided for their daughters was such as to fit them to become musicians? The depth of Woolf's interest in music becomes clear by her early 20s when she moved out of the family home. By 1907, Woolf was attending the opera or concerts in London 3 or 4 times a week. She reflected in 1923, "I told many lies in Covent Garden Opera House. My youth was largely spent there." Above all, Woolf was attending performances of Wagner's operas. She attended the Bayreuth Festival in Germany in 1909. She published 2 essays about Wagner's music, and by 1914 she'd seen all the major music dramas, including the Ring Cycle at least 5 times, and Meistersinger twice within a week in 1909. Her opera attendance was also dominated by Mozart's work, establishing a lifelong admiration and love for Mozart's operas. But she also heard more recent works, including Richard Strauss's sensuous and controversially dissonant Salome of 1905. And she also attended private and public subscription concerts, hearing a great deal of chamber music, particularly keyboard repertoire and string quartets by Beethoven, Mozart and Bach. And she was familiar too with French and Czech chamber music of the mid-19th century onwards, including works by Fauré, Chopin, Ravel, Franck, Dvorak and Debussy. And before the war, we've also heard a range of early music, revived in Britain in the late 19th century by Arnold Dolmetsch and others. After her marriage, the Woolfs listened to music almost daily. In the 1920s, they bought a gramophone and a wireless, typically listening to music after dinner whilst Woolf read or worked. And the Woolf's purchase of a gramophone coincided with Leonard Woolf's activities as a music critic for the journal The Nation and Athenaeum. And it's now clear that in 1925 and 1926, the Woolfs were active subscription members of the National Gramophonic Society. This was a pioneering association founded by Compton Mackenzie in 1923, shortly after the inception of Gramophone magazine. And it commissioned complete recordings of works that were deemed unlikely to have commercial potential. And very interestingly, their repertoire was selected in consultation with the NGS members. And most of the repertoire they recorded was chamber music. Many of the first recordings of canonical works, from Haydn to Beethoven to Ravel, were recorded and released by the NGS. But their recordings also included contemporary music. For example, Schoenberg's groundbreaking, highly chromatic Verklagte Nacht, and works by Vaughan Williams, Eugene Goossens, Peter Warlock, and Arnold Bax. So we know now that membership of the NGS gave the Woolfs familiarity with much more contemporary repertoire than has often been recognised, because her fiction tends to refer to music from the 19th century or from earlier periods. But it's also striking that at a time when the most expensive gramophone records, such as those featuring opera stars, cost the equivalent of a week's working class wage, the notoriously frugal Woolfs were spending a great deal of money on recorded music. By the time of Leonard Woolf's death, their collection included over 570 recordings, some of which he'd replaced as audio technology developed. Furthermore, the Woolfs Hogarth Press published several books about music, and the very first manuscripts which Woolf chose to bind when she was learning the craft of bookbinding was sheet music. So it's hardly a surprise to hear her remark in 1940 to Ethel Smythe, "I want to investigate the influence of music on literature, but there's not a book on music that gives me a hint. Parry or padding. What about Tovey? Too metaphysical." Despite freely employing musical imagery in her writing, however, Woolf was acutely aware of words' limited ability to represent or evoke music. After what she called a divine concert of Haydn, Mozart, Bach and Schubert in 1915, she wrote, One of the things I decided as I listened, it's difficult not to think of other things, was that all descriptions of music are quite worthless and rather unpleasant. They're apt to be hysterical and to say things that people will be ashamed of having said afterwards. And again, she observes in one of her published essays that music criticism is often compromised by vague formulas, comparisons, and adjectives. We're miserably aware how little words can do to render music. But despite these observations, Woolf's writing, of course, includes just such descriptions of music, and many of her formal innovations in narrative perspective, in structure, and in form are indebted to her study of musical techniques and genres. And she repeatedly, consciously turned to music for inspiration. In 1924, anticipating what she called hours of solid pleasure hearing the cellist Guillermino Subia, Woolf stated, "It's music I want to stimulate and suggest." And in 1940, she made the famous observation that I always think of my books as music before I write them. How then might all this evidence of Woolf's musical activities and interests inform a reading of To the Lighthouse? I think one of the things that first strikes us when we read the novel is that To the Lighthouse is saturated with musical metaphors and similes. To give some examples chosen almost at random, here is Mrs. Ramsay from the 3rd chapter, reflecting on the rhythm of domestic life and the soundscape of the seashore. But here, as she turned the page, suddenly her search for the picture of a rake or a mowing machine was interrupted. The gruff murmur, irregularly broken by the taking out of pipes and the putting in of pipes, which had kept on assuring her, though she could not hear what was said as she sat in the window, that the men were happily talking. This sound, which had lasted now half an hour and had taken its place soothingly in the scale of sounds pressing on top of her, such as the tap of balls upon bats, the sudden sharp bark now and then, "How's that? How's that?" of the children playing cricket, had ceased, so that the momentous fall of the waves on the beach, which for the most part beat a measured and soothing tattoo to her thoughts, and seemed consolingly to repeat over and over again as she sat with the children the words of some old cradle song murmured by nature. "I am guarding you, I am your support." But at other times, suddenly and unexpectedly, especially when her mind raised itself slightly from the task actually in hand, had no such kindly meaning, but like a ghostly roll of drums remorselessly beat the measure of life, made one think of the destruction of the island and its engulfment in the sea, and warned her whose day had slipped past in one quick doing after another that it was all ephemeral as a rainbow. This sound, which had been obscured and concealed under the other sounds, suddenly thundered hollow in her ears and made her look up with an impulse of terror. Again, as Mrs. Ramsay observes her husband's momentary crisis of self-confidence, she's reassured that domesticity triumphed, custom crooned its soothing rhythm. It's not only Mrs. Ramsay who figures the world around her in musical terms. Music is linked to Mr. Ramsay too, particularly because of his dominance of the family soundscape through his tendency to declaim poetry out loud, a habit shared by Woolf's father, Leslie Stephen, on whom the character's based. More than once, Mr. Ramsay is presented in extended musical comparisons, which parody him and undercut the patriarchal authority which he represents. In the first section of the novel, Woolf writes, "It was a splendid mind. For if thought is like the keyboard of a piano, divided into so many notes, or like the alphabet is ranged in 26 letters, all in order, then his splendid mind had no sort of difficulty in running over these letters, one by one, firmly and accurately, until it had reached, say, the letter Q." The association of Mr. Ramsay, Leslie Stephen, with the piano is unexpected and barbed, given that Woolf's perception was that her father was congenitally unaware of music. Woolf employs an intriguingly and conspicuously provisional double simile, the first part of which about the piano seems to be abandoned as the comparison unfolds. But the musical simile is sustained longer through the sentence than we might first notice. Words such as running over these letters, one by one, firmly and accurately, more immediately suggests the touch of assured fingers on a piano keyboard, rather than the ostensible subject, the letters of the alphabet. Of course, Woolf's ambivalent simile that acknowledges the splendid reach of Mr. Ramsay's mind, at the same time as ironically registering its limit, only works with the second image. Unlike an alphabet, there's no single starting point on a piano keyboard. A scale on an even-tempered instrument will sound the same from whichever note it begins, and consequently there's no absolute endpoint that would indicate incompletion as damningly as the letter Q. So the simile relies on its second part, the alphabet, to work, and this sharpens Woolf's parody of Leslie Stephen, of her father, when recalling, by using a linguistic simile to undercut her father and male literary tradition more broadly. It seems to me that here she has her cake and eats it, because the point may also be that the black and white keyboard of the piano is also an emblem of the patriarch's simplistic, inflexible thought. The piano keyboard and the alphabet are both images of abstract schema, classification, and rigid order, and they contrast in the novel with the representation of Mrs. Ramsay's mind, and symbolically by extension with the feminine. So an instrument that was in this period so firmly associated with domestic music making, with female amateur performers, thus informs Woolf's parody of Mr. Ramsay. To give another example of music's use to undercut Mr. Ramsay, here is the passage when he is strikingly compared to a cuckoo. "Someone had blundered," he said again, striding off up and down the terrace. But how extraordinarily his note had changed. It was like a cuckoo. In June, he gets out of tune, as if he were trying over, tentatively seeking some phase for a new mood, and having only this at hand, used it, cracked though it was. Sounded ridiculous. Here it's worth noting, I think, that Mr. Ramsay is trying to tune himself up on others' words, which was something that Woolf habitually did as she was settling down to write. She constantly uses that metaphor about her own creative practice. I would tune up by reading the Elizabethans, for example. But this example is not a sympathetic one. The comparison to the cuckoo suggests that his mood is insincere and self-indulgent, and the reference to the music rhyme, the nursery rhyme, "The cuckoo comes in April," evokes the eminent philosopher through a type of knowledge, children's nursery rhymes, that are conspicuously lacking in literary or intellectual prestige. So in these and many other examples, the musical images in the novel contribute to its feminism, and particularly to its criticism of traditional Edwardian expectations about marriage and gender. For instance, Mrs. Ramsay's reflection that marriage resembles musical harmony is a much less glowing one than it might initially appear. Every throb of this pulse seemed, as he walked away, to enclose her and her husband, and to give to each that solace which two different notes, one high, one low, struck together, seemed to give each other as they combined. Yet, as the resonance died and she turned to the fairy tale again, Mrs. Ramsay felt not only exhausted in body, afterwards, not at the time, she always felt this, but also there tinged her physical fatigue some faintly disagreeable sensation with another origin. She returned shortly to the same image, reflecting on the unspoken disappointments and dissatisfactions of their marriage. All this diminished the entire joy, the pure joy, of the two notes sounding together, and let the sound die on her ear now with a dismal flatness. Here I think Woolf's musical images expose gender inequalities and may well be informed by her awareness of male dominance of contemporary music, evident in phenomena such as women's marginalisation in professional orchestras, and the gendered expectations that trivialised the repertoire women were expected to play. To the Lighthouse includes not only numerous musical metaphors, however, but also specific works of music that are identified or evoked in the novel. And these works can help to illuminate Woolf's choice of setting for this work, a choice that so incensed early reviewers, perturbed by the startling and puzzling resemblance of Woolf's fictional Isle of Skye to Cornwall, where Woolf had spent her childhood summers. When Woolf published To the Lighthouse, she had not visited the Hebrides and had visited Scotland only briefly. In 1913, she'd accompanied her husband Leonard, the writer and political theorist, on a tour of factories and cooperatives in the north of England, and Glasgow wasn't the visit she enjoyed. And their second visit to Scotland was a 2-week driving holiday in summer 1938, so 11 years after the publication of To the Lighthouse, during which they visited Melrose, Dryborough to visit Walter Scott's grave, and Galashiels, Edinburgh, Creelarich, Loch Ness, Skye, Speenbridge, Ben Nevis and Oban. So this was Woolf's first visit to the Highlands and to the Hebrides, and at this point they spent 3 days in Skye, setting for To the Lighthouse. Woolf's response to the folk music she heard in Skye in 1938 was ambivalent, to say the least. She described the islanders as great charmers, however, they sing through their noses like musical tea kettles. Woolf's ambivalence was undoubtedly partly informed by the nationalism prominent in the early 20th century folk revival. I've just got some examples of this. Cecil Sharp, founder of the Folk Song Society in 1898 and a leading, if controversial, figure in the folk revival movement for decades, complained in his 1907 book, English Folk Song, "Our system of education is at present too cosmopolitan. It's calculated to produce citizens of the world rather than Englishmen." He praised folk song as a communal and racial product, the expression in musical idiom of aims and ideals that are primarily national in character. The composer and educationalist Hubert Parry gave the inaugural address to the Folk Song Society, and in it he again championed folk music over commercialised contemporary popular music. Similarly, Vaughan Williams and other song recorders omitted from their collections songs that showed any influence of popular urban music, promoting a history of British folk music that ignored several aspects of working class traditional music and elided factors such as urban poverty, international influence and commercial factors in the celebration of an invented English pastoral history. The folk revival has been described as a constructed culture industry. The imaginary Englishness of its pastoral peasant classes was largely for the benefit of nostalgic city dwellers. The folk song collector Dorothea Borlase in E.M. Forster's unfinished novel Arctic Summer, drafted during 1911 and 1912, expresses this prevalent ideology. All that was beautiful and pure, and there was much, would be sifted out of the chaff and resown. As Georgina Boyce has observed in her fine study, all the values projected onto rural life, simplicity, purity, directness, unaffected beauty, were suddenly given a focus and made available in the concrete forms of song and dance. A lyrical summation of the national character appeared in place of vulgar jingoism. Vanessa Manheim has persuasively proposed that Woolf was particularly suspicious of the revivalists' emphasis on the purity of folk music, in contrast to foreign art music and popular urban repertoire. And her reservations may also have had a further cause. Although the folk revival celebrated collective, anonymous music, it didn't rehabilitate women, as many might have expected. As we'll see shortly, Woolf's representations of working class women singers in the Time Passes section of To the Lighthouse differ from the revivalists' concerns. They not only centralise women's voices, but they also reflect the intersection of folk music with popular genres such as the music hall. In addition to the nationalism that underpinned the folk revival's polemical works and critical practice, its spokesman also expounded a model of musical identity that had a strong class inflection, with an emphasis on social improvement. Informed by contemporary perceptions of the need to reform commercial popular music, the revivalists turned to folk culture. It was a national art, produced by the race before the emergence of capitalism and class. Numerous writings advocated leisure activities such as folk dance for the working classes that were explicitly intended to divert workers from party political activity and from urban internationalist entertainment offered by music halls or pubs.
folk dance and song offered, as Virginia Boyes puts it, pleasing prospects of a comprehensive remedy for vulgarity and a distraction from social agitation. Very tellingly, presidency of the English Folk Dance Society was almost invariably awarded to members of the local nobility. By 1931, of the 40 branch presidents, 37 of them were titled, indicating the social conservatism and the value placed on feudal patronage by the Folk Dance Society. And the ideological appeal of this movement was so extensive that there were parliamentary debates about the appropriate folk song and dance to be taught in schools. By 1905, English folk songs, not Scottish, Irish or Welsh, were, Cecil Sharp argued, ideal musical food for young English children. So as we might expect, knowing Woolf's cosmopolitanism, her letters and her diaries express scathing assessments of composers or musical works she perceived as nationalist or patriotic. After hearing the national anthem and work by Henry Wood at the Queen's Hall in 1915, Woolf wrote in her diary, "I found the patriotic sentiment so revolting that I was nearly sick." She heard a patriotic review at the Coliseum in 1915 consisting of sea shanties, songs by Elgar and national anthems, and years later she would congratulate Ethel Smythe for beating Elgar in a joint programme. In 1919, she described what she called the amusing and instructive spectacle of Morris dancing and of naval songs, sea shanties and folk songs performed by a choir of 500 in Trafalgar Square for Lifeboat Day. And in a letter of 1933, she wrote again to Smythe, "What a joy you snubbed Delius," and asked her about her cousin by marriage, Raythorn Williams. "Is he a great composer? If so, why does he sound so dull?" Now, some of these remarks may, of course, spring from gossip, feminism and mischief, and affection for Smythe, but another letter points to a more specific cause. To my thinking, folk songs are the ruin of all modern music, just as Singer and Yeats ruined themselves with keening Celtic dirges. And the allusions to the Celtic revival suggest that, again, it's the nationalist agenda that troubles Woolf. So she was undoubtedly attracted to the communal, accessible qualities of folk music, but extremely wary of its appropriation by any type of nationalism. While Woolf was writing To the Lighthouse, she had numerous opportunities to observe the activities of the folk revivalists. In the early 1920s, Gramophone magazine, which the Woolfs would have received as members of the NGS, published several articles on English folk song and dance by exponents of the folk revival. But in To the Lighthouse, Woolf records instead the painful, complex histories narrated by folk music. She undercuts nationalism by recalling to us as readers the historically embedded qualities of these works. Particularly in To the Lighthouse, she uses folk song to evoke Skye's history as a site of acute repression by and repeated resistance to English forces. And one such example is the Skye Boat song. This air, which we're going to hear later in the concert, was collected in the 1870s by Anne Campbell MacLeod and first published in Songs of the North in 1884. It was collected frequently in the Celanese and first recorded in 1899, so it's very widely known. The song records Bonnie Prince Charlie's flight to Skye after the defeat of Jacobite troops at Culloden, but it's also often sung as a lullaby, and it may well be the cradle song of which Mrs. Ramsay is thinking in the passage I read earlier. So in the novel, Woolf often uses songs that evoke political strife and menace, despite or against their lilting music. And these musical allusions are used to amplify the threats behind the apparent idyll of the Ramsay family's sojourn in Skye with their guests, tensions about which Jane Goldman has written very eloquently. Furthermore, the novel repeatedly suggests parallels between England's relationship to Skye and England's exploitative colonial enterprises across the globe. For instance, the conspicuously exotic plants planted in the Ramsays' garden, which so irritated many contemporary readers, the consumption of bananas and coffee by the Ramsays, and the conch shell, which is placed in the middle of the dinner party centrepiece, may well be intended to evoke the consumption, even the plundering of resources from colonial territories by English colonisers. As David Bradshaw has put it, the Ramsay's house is a place where the fruits of empire are enjoyed, and where Britain's ingestion of other people's lands is formally arranged to please the eye. Furthermore, in a draft of the novel, the cleaner Mrs. McNab, who visits the house as it decays in the Time Passes section set during the First World War, is described as nothing but a mat for kings and kaisers to stand on. She repeatedly reflects on her absentee English employers. They never sent, they never wrote. So in this context, it's telling that Mrs. McNab, one of the few Skye residents we meet in the novel, doesn't sing the folk music that reminded Wolfe of a boiling kettle. She sings instead what's described as an old music hall song. Rubbing the glass of the long looking glass and leering sideways at her swinging figure, a sound issued from her lips. Something that had been gay 20 years on the stage before, perhaps, had been hummed and danced to, but now, coming from the toothless, bonneted caretaking woman, was robbed of meaning. She seemed to say how it was one long sorrow and trouble. It was not easy or snug, this world she had known for close on 70 years. Bowed down she was with weariness. It's a telling detail, I think. Mrs. McNab and her other elderly companion, Mrs. Bast, who sings with her as she cleans, is not singing her local repertoire you might expect to find in a cliched portrait of a Skye resident or a picturesque travel narrative, the kind of music appropriate to a working class folk figure, or what the folk revivalists might expect to be appropriate to a working class folk figure. Instead, these elderly ladies are singing from the tradition of music hall song. Mrs. McNab's taste is for staged, metropolitan, commercially successful, and crucially cosmopolitan music hall material, and it was music halls' debts to and exchanges with musical traditions from continental Europe and from America that offended a number of contemporary music critics and commentators. So Woolf very discreetly embeds this detail about the cosmopolitan taste of a figure who many of her contemporaries would have held up as an exemplar of the Scottish folk traditions. And the other pieces of music named in the novel amplify these concerns. In section 1, The Window, Andrew is watching Minter on the beach, and he reflects, "She didn't seem to mind what she said or did. Suddenly now she pitched down on the edge of the cliff and began to sing some song about damn your eyes, damn your eyes. They all had to join in together and sing the chorus and shout out together, damn your eyes, damn your eyes." Probably the only time that's been quoted during Stan's this year, I think. These words come from the chorus of the English broadside ballad Sam Hall, a work that dates back at least to the early 18th century and which has had a very long and varied history in music hall in Britain and also in American folk music. It's been recorded by Johnny Cash, among many others, for example. And there are many different versions of it in existence, sometimes titled Jack Hall, and the words are often altered to fit particular local settings or local contexts. But the core subject that recurs in most of the versions, or all of the versions, is that of an unrepentant murderer, often someone who has been, an orphan who's been forced to become a chimney sweep in childhood, an unrepentant murderer at the gallows who is defiantly cursing his accusers. Now, there are, the folk histories indicate that there were only 6 or 7 versions of this British ballad recorded in the late 19th century, and those early recordings, transcriptions, are very difficult to come by. So what I've taken a bit of a liberty, which I hope you'll forgive, which is to use a recent version from the American folk tradition. So this is Sam Shepard performing a version of the song from the 2011 Western blackthorn. So the music is obviously different, but what you can hear is the subject matter and the words of the ballad.
Well, my name it is Sam Hall, Sam Hall. My name it is Sam Hall, it is Sam Hall. Well, my name it is Sam Hall, and I hate you one and all. I hate you one and all. Damn your eyes. Well, I killed a man, they said, so they said. I killed a man, they said, so they said. Well, I killed a man, they said, and I smashed in his head, and I left him laying dead. Well, damn his eyes. To the gallows I must go, I must go. To the gallows I must go, I must go. Well, a-swinging I must go, while all you critters down below yell up, Sam, I told you so. Well, damn your eyes. I saw Molly in the crowd, in the crowd. I saw Molly in the crowd, in the crowd. Well, I saw Molly in the crowd, and I hollered right out loud, hey now Molly, ain't you proud? Well, damn your eyes. Well, the preacher, he did come, he did come. Yeah, the preacher, he did come, he did come. Well, the preacher, he did come, and he preached to kingdom come. I said, kiss my bloody bum, and damn your eyes. Well, my name is Samuel, Samuel. My name is Samuel, Samuel. My name is Samuel, and I'll see you all in hell. I'll see you all in hell. Well, damn your eyes.
I should also mention, since I said I've taken liberties by using a modern version and an American version of that, this ballad has had a very extensive afterlife as a drinking song in the American forces, apparently, and I selected a version that had a moderate amount of swearing, but nothing I thought would be too offensive, so I hope that's the case. But whether we're hearing this ballad to American folk music in a Western, or hearing a late 19th century version recorded by folk music transcribers, I think you'll agree it's an unexpected work to put against To the Lighthouse and to think of as being in some way conjured or evoked by Woolf in that novel. One of the things that's so striking about it is the violence that these allusions to music introduce into what is a benign scene of childhood. They amplify one of the activities implicit in the novel, which was the extensive submarine activity around Skye during the war. It's also worth remembering that the metrics and melody of the most common British version are based on the tune Ye Jacobites by Name, a song that damned the Jacobite troops, but which was then set by Burns, who turned the anti-Jacobite sentiment into a more humanist pacifism. So again, this particular song, which is just quoted so fleetingly by children mucking about on the beach, again discreetly augments Woolf's attention to Anglo-Scottish conflict in the novel, suggesting why it was so important for her to set this work not just in Scotland, but in Skye specifically. To the Lighthouse is undoubtedly a novel which is fascinated by the formal parallels between music and writing. We only need to remember how often the words rhythm and various types of rhythm are represented in the work, whether oceanic rhythm that we heard about in some of the seascapes about which I read, natural rhythm, bodily rhythm, lexical rhythm, a conspicuous subject in the novel because partly of Mr. Ramsay's declamation of poetry. So the allusions to rhythm are one instance of the novel's attention to the formal parallels between music and writing, reflected in E.M. Forster's observation that this was a novel in sonata form. But as I hope I've also suggested here, this is a novel which is profoundly interested in the cultural function of music, the way in which it shapes ideas about gender, about national identity, and the representation of history. So thank you very much.